This presentation will focus on the South African writer Nadine Gordimer, but I would like to begin by mentioning perhaps the most well-known South African, Nelson Mandela. Mandela has become the icon of struggle against apartheid, and justifiably so. He devoted his whole long life to the fight against racial segregation that existed in his country from 1948 to 1994. Indicted for treason in 1962, he spent 27.5 years in prison, or to be more precise, in 3 different prisons, only to be released in 1990. Living most of this time in a maximum security prison on Robben Island, he divided his time between compulsory labor, the discussions with his comrades and fellow prisoners, and the study of books. One of the books that he read was Burger's Daughter, a novel written by Nadine Gordimer and published in 1979. Burger's Daughter tells the story of a young woman whose father is imprisoned for his political activities. He dies 3 years after being put into prison. For several years, Rosa Burger lives in the shadow of her father, wondering whether to follow him in his footsteps by becoming a political activist. After initially rejecting this option, she does become involved in the struggle against racial oppression by devoting her life to her native South Africa. Mandela read Burger's Daughter with interest, and also because of this book, Gordimer became an important writer for him. As Aleka Burma writes, one of the first women writers he, meaning Mandela, ever encountered, his precious girl, Nadine Gordimer, especially her Burger's Daughter, took him beyond visible horizons, as he once commented, and changed his perspective on gender roles in the struggle. In other words, reading Gordimer's novel, Mandela began to appreciate the role of women in the fight against racial oppression. In some way, this story illustrates Gordimer's importance as a writer. By influencing Mandela, the leader of the opposition and the future president of South Africa, she took part in what Mandela called the long walk to freedom. While this is not the only way in which Gordimer contributed to the democratic changes in her country, this story does illustrate Gordimer's goal as a writer, to write in such a way as to influence her readers, for example, their opinions about what apartheid was and how it could be fought. With time, Gordimer came to be regarded as one of South Africa's most important writers, and her works came to be regarded as a record of South Africa's gradual liberation. This year, I think, is a good opportunity to revisit her life and her works, because 2023 is the 100th anniversary of her birth. And while Gordimer is no longer with us, she died in 2014, her works continue to be read by people across the world. My aim in this presentation is not so much to analyze Gordimer's works, but rather to offer some general comments about her life and her writing. Those who know little about Gordimer may treat this as an opportunity to learn about her life and about her native South Africa. Those who have read Gordimer's books may perhaps learn a few more things about this topic. Gordimer was born on the 20th of November 1923 in a small gold mining town of Springs near Johannesburg. She was the daughter of immigrants. Her mother, Hannah Myers, came from a middle-class English family of Jewish origins that came to South Africa when Hannah was 6. Her father Isidor Gordimer, was born in a Jewish family in Lithuania and emigrated to South Africa at the age of 13 to start a new life as a watchmaker. Nadine's early life was shaped by her proactive mother, who encouraged her participation in various social and cultural events. Most importantly, it was her mother who introduced Nadine at the age of 6 to the pleasures of reading by signing her into the local library. In an interview that Gordimer gave in 2005, she emphasized that joining this library was one of the most important events in her career. And even at the age of 80, she continued to consider this library as, I quote, "my principal source of education." She then went on to note that had she been a black child, she would not have had the opportunity to join this library, and so, in all likelihood, she would not have become a writer. Let me add at this point that at the time when Gordimer was beginning to read in the 1930s, access to many public facilities, for example libraries or cinemas, was restricted to the white population. As a child, just like many white South Africans, Gordimer took this situation for granted because she grew up in a system of racial segregation that gave the white population much better access to, for example, housing, healthcare, education, entertainment, and so on. Gordimer began to read when she was only 6, and she began to write soon after. She published her first story in a children's magazine in 1937 when she was only 14. Her first collection of stories, Face to Face, was published in 1949. Soon after, Gordimer began to send her stories to American magazines, where they were subsequently published in such prestigious magazines as, for example, The New Yorker. The stories that established her career, especially in the eyes of British and American readers, were published in a volume called The Soft Voice of the Serpent. 1 year before her book was published, in 1948, when Gordimer was 25, the National Party won the general elections. In the late 1940s and the 1950s, this party began to create laws that introduced the system of racial segregation that came to be known as apartheid, a word derived from Afrikaans meaning apartness or the state of being apart. Indeed, the aim of the National Party was precisely to keep the races apart by introducing divisions into 3 races, the black, colored and white, by banning cross-racial marriage, by restricting the freedom of movement of black South Africans, and by introducing segregated education in schools and universities. In her 20s and 30s at the time, Gordimer strongly opposed the laws of apartheid. In a lecture delivered at an African seminar in Washington, D.C., titled "What is Apartheid?" She argued, "My opposition to apartheid is compounded not only out of sense of justice, but also out of a personal, selfish and extreme distaste for having the choice of my friends dictated to me and the range of human intercourse prescribed for me." Gordimer's reaction was to ignore, as far as possible, the laws of racial segregation. As she once said in an interview, "I felt that all I needed in my own behavior was to ignore and defy the color bar." This attitude was widespread among young, educated people of the late 1940s and the 1950s, who strongly believed that by ignoring or defying unjust and artificial divisions between people, they can help to bring down the system. The dream of liberalism and multiculturalism came to an abrupt end in the early 1960s, when it became clear that the state was using violence to fight with the opponents of the system. On the 21st of March 1960, police attacked anti-pass demonstrators in Sharpeville, killing 69 and wounding 186 people. After the Sharpeville massacre, the main opposition parties, for example the African National Congress and the Pan-Africanist Congress, were declared illegal. The leaders of these parties felt that they had no choice but to respond violently to the violence of the state. As Nelson Mandela argued, firstly, we believe that as a result of government policy, violence by the African people had become inevitable. Secondly, we felt that without violence, there would be no way open to the African people to succeed in their struggle against the principle of white supremacy. Let me add that violence was not the only means used by the opposers of apartheid. There were also boycotts and campaigns of civil disobedience, but the next decades would prove decidedly more bloody and dramatic than the 1950s. Gordimer's response to the radicalization of anti-apartheid struggle was not to endorse violence as a means of reaching political goals, but rather to try and find out what makes people take up armed resistance and, in this way, risk their lives and the lives of their families. This brings me to an important point that Gordimer often made in the context of her writing. She emphasized that she was not a political writer. In other words, her aim is not to promote a given political option, although, of course, she defied the laws of apartheid, but rather to find out what makes people involved in politics in the first place. She explored this topic both in her novels and in her short stories, beginning with the 1960s, ending with her last novel, published in 2012. It is also because of this interest in politics as one of the driving forces of human lives that her books reflect the times in which they were written. The optimistic decade of the 1950s, the ever more radical times of the 1960s and the 1970s, the widespread violence and chaos of the 1980s, and finally, the end of apartheid in the early 1990s. Gordimer's great contribution to South African and, more widely, world literature was recognized in 1991 when she became the first South African writer to be awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. What I have said so far about Gordimer may suggest that she focused mainly on politics, and she is indeed seen by some as the chronicler of apartheid. This view is not entirely accurate for three reasons. First of all, Gordimer's long and fruitful career reached beyond apartheid. What I mean by this is that she continued to publish her books after the 1994 democratic elections, as a result of which Nelson Mandela was chosen president and his party, the African National Congress, came into power. After the 1994 elections, Gordimer continued to write about her native country, exploring both the promises of this newly acquired freedom and the dangers of betraying this promise. So first of all, the promise of racial and social equality, and the dangers of betraying this promise, for example, by political corruption. She also wrote about such topics as, for example, inequality, poverty, and environmental degradation. The second reason why Gordimer was more than simply the chronicler of apartheid was that she was not interested merely in recording facts about the history and politics of her country, but in exploring human motivations. In other words, what makes people act in a particular way. Gordimer strongly believed that the goal of all writers was to look for truth about human beings, and this truth can be located not in history, in politics, but in life, and it is only reflected in literature. This kind of truth that can be found in life is not simple and static, but rather dynamic and changeable. First of all, because human beings often have complex motivations, and secondly, because the history and politics in which they are involved are often complicated. Nonetheless, if writers have talent, they can capture the truth about people living in a particular moment in time. In other words, they can stay faithful to the experience of the people described. To capture this truth about people living in her native South Africa was Nadine Gordimer's main goal. Why do I insist so much in this talk that Gordimer was more than the chronicler of apartheid? Because her works continue to be read in this way, and this is perhaps why she has fallen out of fashion. One person who noticed this tendency was Chris Power, a writer and literary critic who wrote an article about Gordimer in 2019 and published it in The Guardian. Power's main argument is that following Gordimer's death in 2014, her stories have not received the attention they deserve. One reason for this fall in popularity is the enduring tendency to view her works in the context of the times in which they were created. As Power wrote, Gordimer was defined by a historical moment, the apartheid era, and now it appears she has been trapped by it. I am sure that there will come a time when Gordimer's works will not be read in this limited way. There is one more reason why this should happen, and this is the third reason why Gordimer was not only the chronicler of apartheid. It is because history and politics in South Africa were not her primary focus of interest. She emphasized quite often in her interviews that her focus was mainly human relationships. The relationships between women and men, between parents and children, between different races living side by side in her native South Africa. It is this, I would call it, interpersonal dimension of Gordimer's works that make them worthwhile, even to readers who know little about South Africa. For the conclusion of this presentation, I would like to return briefly to the interview that Gordimer gave in 2005. Answering Simon Stanford's question whether she would be a different kind of writer if she had a more academic background, she gave the following answer. No, I wouldn't have been. If you're going to be a writer, you can make the death of a canary important. You could connect it to the whole chain of life and the mystery of life. For Gordimer, explaining the mystery of life did not necessarily involve describing big social and political changes. It also meant focusing on things and events on a much smaller scale, for example, the death of a canary. In her novels and her stories, we often come across small and seemingly trivial events which are described in such a way that they do indeed make us think about the mystery of human life, about our motivations, the relationships we form with others, and our place in the world. It is this characteristic of Gordimer's books, and the books of all great writers, I would argue, which make them timeless and not only chronicles of apartheid. Thank you.